Guernica is a small town near the Basque capital of Bilbao in northern Spain. The Basques, a non-Latin people of uncertain origin, with their own language and culture, had always asserted their right to autonomy. At the start of the war, pressed from all sides, the Republican government had conceded full autonomy to the Basques, who formed an independent republic. The Basque leaders were mostly men of the middle class and devout Catholics, and although they remained solidly on the side of the Republican government in Madrid, they retained the support of the Church. The spectacle, therefore, as the nationalist forces moved against the Basque state, was a curious one. A deeply respectable, somewhat old-fashioned and devoutly Catholic republic under attack by another traditionalist group, linked equally closely with the Church and fighting in the name of Christ as well as fascism. General Emilio Mola, leading the nationalist forces, began his campaign by issuing on March 31st, 1937, a threat letter to be directly linked to the fate of Guernica. Quote, "If submission is not immediate, I will raze all Vizcaya," which is a Basque province, to the ground, beginning with the industries of war. I have the means to do so. End quote. The means were squadrons of German planes with German pilots, which helped Mola roll back the ill-organized Basque troops until, by Monday, April 26, 1937, his forces were only 10 miles out from Guernica. During the next 24 hours, Guernica was destroyed, leveled by nationalist bombers. The death toll has never been established, estimates ranging from 1,000 to 2,000. When news of this appeared in British and American newspapers, it caused a wave of outrage that has never really subsided. Guernica became the point of time which a total war said to have begun. The indiscriminate bombing of a civilian target as a deliberate experiment in terror. The repercussions were immense. Guernica became a watershed in the war. Time, Life, and later Newsweek, for instance, thereafter taking the Republican side. All the dire predictions of the effects of mass air raids that had dominated thinking in early parts of the Second World War flowed from the bombing in Spain, particularly of Guernica and Barcelona. The British Foreign Office had sent observers to Spain to report the effects of the bombing, and the event passed into the traditions of the left as a symbol of everything hateful about fascism, a turning point in history enshrined in Picasso's masterpiece, and as firmly believed nearly 40 years later as on the dreadful day it occurred. The Guernica story begins with one man, George L. Steer, the correspondent of the Times of London, who had covered the war in Abyssinia and had been reporting in Spain from the Republican side. On the Monday afternoon of the bombing, Steer was making for Guernica by car, accompanied by Christopher Holm of Reuters, some miles from the town. At the village of Ambasegui, 6 Heinkel 51 planes appeared from the direction of Guernica and began to bomb and strafe the village. When they spotted Steer and Holm, by now sprawled at the bottom of a bomb crater, they devoted some 15 minutes to attempting to machine gun them before flying off. The 2 Englishmen returned to Bilbao and were having dinner that night with some other correspondents when word arrived that all Guernica was burning. At first the correspondents considered this to be a wildly exaggerated rumor, but they decided they should check it. Steer, Holm, Noel Monks of the Daily Express, and the Belgian Matthew Corman of Ce Soir, a new Paris afternoon daily financed by the Spanish Republican money, set off together. Steer recorded later in his book The Tree of Guernica what they saw as they drew near. Quote, 15 miles south of Guernica, the sky began to impress us. It was not the flat, dead sky of night. It seemed to move and carry trembling veins of blood, A bloom of life gave it body, flushed its smooth round skin. Nearer it became a gorgeous pink, the sort of pink that Parisians have dreamed of for centuries, and it seemed enormously fat, and it was beginning to disgust us. End quote. What the correspondents learned when they entered Guernica was that night appeared at when they entered Guernica that night appeared in the London evening papers of Tuesday, April 27th, in the Reuters report from home. Steer's story was in the Times and the New York Times on the following morning. Steer later said that the Times, which was already deep into its appeasement of Germany's stance, was very unhappy with the story, but felt obliged to run it. In the event, it featured the Dispatch, and the turnover column was the leading page. Guernica, the most ancient town of the Basques and the center of their cultural tradition, was completely destroyed yesterday by insurgent air raiders. The bombardment of this open town far behind the lines of occupied precisely 3 hours and a quarter, during which a powerful fleet of aeroplanes consisting of 3 German types Junkers and Heinkel bombers and Heinkel fighters did not cease unloading the town bombs weighing from 1,000 pounds downwards, and its calculated more than 3,000 2-pounder aluminum incendiary projectiles. The fighters, meanwhile, plunged low from above the center of the town to machine-gun those of the civilian population who had taken refuge in the fields. There followed a passage indicating that the Casa de Juntas, a building that housed the Basque archives, and the historic oak under which the kings of Spain swore to uphold Basque rights, both remained untouched, a fact that could be made of some significance, and which we will return to later. Then came the essential detail. At 2 a.m. today, when I visited the town, Steer was being careful not to claim eyewitness status, a precaution that tends to encourage the reader's acceptance of firm assertions, such as this paragraph, the most important in his account. In the form of its execution and scale of its destruction it wrought, no less than in the selection of its objective. The raid on Guernica is unparalleled in military history. Guernica was not a military objective. A factory producing war material lay outside the town and was untouched. The object of the bombardment was seemingly the demoralization of the civil population and the destruction of the cradle of the Basque race. Every fact bears out this appreciation, beginning with the day when the deed was done. Monday was the customary market day in Guernica. Next came a further description of the bombing, a very cautious estimate of the number of casualties, and accounts of victims had to still be trapped in shelters. The tactics of the bombers, which may be of interest to students of the new military science, wrote Steer, his outrage burning under the irony, were as follows, and he set out in detail the way people were driven into the open only to be machine-gunned from the air, and then, once they had been driven to take shelter again, the way the town was laid open by high explosives and saturated by incendiary bombs, dropped from wave after wave of bombers, which appeared at 20-minute intervals, methodically quartering the town. Steer's glory tallied substantially with those of his colleagues, but his interpretation and his accusations of a new kind of warfare were the most precise, the most thoroughly argued, and the most extreme. Christopher Holm has remembered reading the story and thinking how much better it was than his own account. It was also clear that Steer brought the charge with passion, and it was in this account that the generally accepted version of Guernica had its origins. The response from the Franco side was an immediate categorical denial of the charge, backed by a statement that no nationalist planes had been in the air at all that time of attack. There was never taken very seriously, since it left open the possibility that the planes had been German, but what was taken seriously was the simultaneous allegation that the Republicans had set fire to Guernica themselves. Quote, Guernica was destroyed by incendiaries and petrol, was bombed and converted into ruins by the Red Hordes, end quote, said the official press release, Franco release. The Franco forces said they would prove this allegation the minute they captured Guernica. That happened 3 days later, and the evidence for the Franco position was presented by 3 war correspondents. The first, Pembroke Stevens of the Daily Telegraph, entered the town with the Nationalists just 1 hour after the retreat of the Basque forces. He wrote a very uninformative dispatch, merely describing the desolation and quoting some excited and distracted women who told him that their homes had been destroyed at night by fire, which cited Steer's original story as well as the Franco countercharge. 4 days later, a party of nationalist-accredited correspondents was conducted through the town. The most important of these were Carney of the New York Times and James Holborn of the Times of London. Predictably, Carney's report showed that he had been convinced by the Franco version. This writer found that most of the destruction could have been the result of fires and dynamiting. Holborn's report was a different matter. Written from Victoria and dated May 4th, it appeared in the Times and in the New York Times the following day. It said that the fire had destroyed much of the evidence of its origins, but that the town had been bombed intermittently for 3 hours. Holborn wrote that he had been unable to find many craters and that he had noticed many unmarked facades of burnt-out houses. In these circumstances, wrote Holborn, it is difficult to believe that Guernica was a target for bombardment of exceptional severity. It was selected by the Nationalists for an experiment with incendiary bombs. There are important points to make about this dispatch. First, it was written by Holborn, not, as has been widely believed, by the Times' other correspondent with the Nationalists, H.A.R. Kim Philby. Philby was in Spain constructing for himself the impeccable facade of a correspondent with quiet but solid pro-fascist views, so as to get close as possible to the Franco authorities and to the Germans, not for the benefit of his paper, but for his real employer, the Soviet Intelligence Service, or KGB. Philby has told me that he never wrote anything from Spain that he knew to be untrue. But the truth can be looked at through many pairs of spectacles, and the pairs I used for ulterior purposes were supplied by Franco and the Legion Condor. After Philby defected to the Soviet Union in 1963, many authors found particular significance in the Times report on Guernica on May 5th because they mistakenly believed that it had been written by Philby, the KGB agent. One Spanish writer drew a fundamental historical parallel from the fact that Steer was on one side of Guernica and Philby was on the other. All this had confused the real importance of Holborn's dispatch. Holborn, like most correspondents reporting on the nationalist side, worked under considerable difficulties. The nationalist method of handling war correspondence was based on the British system in the First World War as observed by a Spanish correspondent, Luis Bonin. Correspondents were given regular briefings and were allowed to make concessional sorties to the front, but always under the supervision of a Spanish, German, or Italian conducting officer. There was rigorous censorship, and it was made clear to the correspondents where their sympathies were expected to lie. If they cooperated, they might be rewarded. Christopher Holm, has recalled that correspondents in Salamanca were at one stage offered about $1,000 to record favorable broadcasts for the Italian radio. If, on the other hand, a correspondent did not show sympathy for the Franco cause, he could be in difficulties. At the time of Guernica, there was one correspondent of the French news agency, Havas, a nationalist prison, and another under house arrest. Yet, writing under these difficult circumstances, Holborn managed to get out his story from Vittoria, almost buried from the propaganda necessary to please the censors, the basic point that the nationalists had bombed Guernica, and that a fact that had been strenuously denied. The story now gathered momentum, principally in Britain, the United States, and Germany. In France, Havas had reported the bombing in a dispatch totaling only 87 words. Then, when its Franco-accredited correspondent sent a telegram giving the nationalist version, the agency ignored a coded prefix, indicating that the story was either false or sent under pressure, and published it. Steer returned to the attack with another dispatch, on which he produced additional evidence. Colleagues had kept pieces of German bombs, trees had been snapped off at base, there had been no odor of petrol, the dead had wounds consistent with bomb fragments. He restated his initial conclusion, one that was proved remarkably prophetic. General Franco's airplanes burnt Guernica, and the Basques will never forget it. The Times printed Steer's second story with an even more reluctance than it had displayed over his first account. The newspaper's record on Spain was patchy. It had successfully resisted a nationalist attempt to get it to drop the term insurgent. It has never been used in the Times in any slight sense, and it did not give Luis Bolan much of a hearing when he called several times at Printing House Square to try to persuade the paper to send senior members of the staff to visit General Franco. But it buckled under German pressure, and it begrudged Steer its support when he needed it most. When German newspapers called the Times a liar, and there were official German complaints about its reporting from Spain, the editor, Geoffrey Dawson, wrote to his former Berlin correspondent, "I did my best, night after night, to keep out the paper of anything that might hurt the German susceptibilities. No doubt they were annoyed by Steer's first story on the bombing of Guernica, but its essential accuracy has never been denied, and there has never been any attempt here to rub it in or hop on it." Then, in 1939, when Steer began a libel action against a critic who said he had left the Times after a dispute over the accuracy of the Guernica story, the newspaper gave him little help. At first, it stated that Steer had not been representing it at the time of Guernica, and it finally agreed, only under pressure, that his departure from the newspaper had nothing to do with the Guernica reports, but had been for personal reasons. To this day, there are some who claim that the bombing of Guernica was a myth, a brilliant propaganda coup conjured up by the Republicans, and that Steer was primarily responsible for disseminating it. See, for example, The Great Guernica Fraud by Jeffrey Hart in the National Review, published January 5, 1973. The principal supporter of this view was a former press officer, Luis Bolan, who set out his case in his book, Spain, the Vital Years. Bolan cast doubt on Steer's credibility by noting that Steer became an intelligence officer in the Second World War, and that his job included creating and disseminating false reports to discredit, among others, the enemies of Emperor Haile Selassie of Abyssinia, and that, on Steer's own admission, when the Emperor did not approve of this campaign, he forged the imperial seal. While this does not add our confidence in Steer's treatment of fact, it is not evidence that he lied about Guernica. Poland also produced a series of routine dispatches from the Franco forces in Guernica, accusing the Basques of burning and dynamiting the town themselves. Poland claimed that the fact that Guernica tree and the building housing surrounding the Basque archives were not destroyed lent weight to a nationalist version because if the bombing had been as intense as the Republicans claimed, was it not suspicious that these two venerated objects survived? Bolin remained, and until his death in 1969, a propagandist for the national cause, but his book, published in 1967, served to rekindle the controversy. Professor Thomas later re-examined the conclusions he had reached after an investigation in 1959, that it is difficult not to conclude that the Germans deliberately bombed the town in an attempt to destroy it, observe in a clinical way the effects of such a devastating attack, and thus carry out the destruction of Mola of 31st March. Herbert Southworth, an expert on the Spanish Civil War, formerly a Regents Professor of History at the University of California in San Diego, embarked on the definitive account of Guernica. These two historians must rank as the world's authorities on the subject, so they were asked what they now believe. Professor Thomas wrote, "I continue to believe that the town was bombed by the Germans, though A, not necessarily with the knowledge of the Spanish High Command, and B, probably not as a shock attack on a specially prized city, but as one on a town where the Republican Basque forces could regroup." Southworth wrote, "Guernica was destroyed by explosive and incendiary bombs dropped from German aeroplanes, piloted by Germans. The bombing was done at the request of Spanish authorities. It was an operation done by men in the field, and it seems highly probable that the Condor Legion and the Spaniards told the truth to Berlin only later and in dribbles. It was highly a successful military operation, which had the advantage of the right wind and the right time to spread the flames. Why was it done? This is more speculative. There's nothing to show that the Germans wanted to test civilian morale. German documents tend to show that that was a tactical operation." So, Steer's original accusations, the birth of the legend of Guernica, that the town was not a military objective, and that the purpose of the bombing was the demoralization of the civilian population, now stand contradicted. Thomas says that it was not a shock attack. Southworth says that Guernica was a town. That there is nothing to show the Germans wanted to test civilian morale. Thomas says that Guernica was a town where Republican Basque forces could regroup, in other words, a military objective. Southworth that the bombing was a tactical operation. Thus, it is clear that the correspondence made Guernica. If Steer and, to a lesser extent, Holm, Monks, and Coleman had not been there to write about it, Guernica would have passed unnoticed, just another incident in a brutal civil war. Yet the conclusions must be that Steer, with understandable professional, political, and personal ardor, overreacted to the story. On all the evidence available, Guernica was not bombed. Was bombed for tactical military reasons. The nationalists, instead of saying that war is hell and it is sometimes necessary to bomb towns for reasons, became apprehensive about reaction abroad, especially in the United States and Britain. One nationalist officer did indeed say virtually that. In October 1937, he told Virginia Cowles, the correspondent for the Sunday Times of London, "We bombed it and bombed it and bombed it, and bueno, why not?" They panicked and committed themselves first to outright denials that there had been any bombing, and then to the untenable Basque self-destruction stance. If Guernica became a symbol of fascist barbarity, then the symbol of Republican sacrifice was the moment of death. Robert Capa's moving photograph of a Republican militiaman falling backwards, arms outflung, under the soil of the Spain he had tried to defend. Capa was an able and brave photographer who covered wars in most parts of the world before he was killed doing his job when he stepped on a mine while on patrol in the French south of Hanoi in 1954. But the moment of death photograph, he was scarcely known, and the single picture marked the beginning of his fame. It first appeared in 2 French magazines, in Vous in September and in Regards in October of 1936, but gained international renown with its publication in Life magazine, July 12, 1937. It has since become the most reprinted photograph of the Spanish Civil War and is considered by many professionals to be the best war photograph ever taken, one that cameramen from the Second World War to Vietnam have envied. Yet the curious thing about it now is that it does not tell us anything as a picture. It is essentially an ambiguous image. However, as captioned in Life, Robert Capa's camera catches a Spanish soldier the instant he's dropped by a bullet through the head at the front of Cordoba. It does tell us something beyond the face meaning of the words. It tells us that the picture was taken by someone who must have put himself at great risk, someone who was perhaps nearly killed as well. With this caption, the photograph thus became famous and valuable property in both political and commercial terms. Yet, and there is nothing in the photograph to deny this, if we were to rewrite the caption to read, "A militiaman slips and falls while training for action," the photograph would become worthless in the above senses. Since there is something wrong with the values of a journalistic world that accepts as an important image a photograph that so clearly depends on the caption for its authentication, we set out to discover something more about the circumstances in which the picture was taken. When and exactly where did Capa take it? The terrain in the photograph tells us nothing. It could be anywhere. Who is the man? His face is blurred, but there appears to be no sign of a wound, certainly not the explosion of a skull that the bullet in the head from the Life caption would cause. In fact, he is still wearing his cap. How did Capa come to be alongside him, camera aimed at him, lens reasonably in focus, just as the man was shot to death? We turn to Capa's own writing for an answer, but although he gives details of other photographs, he appears to have written nothing about the moment of death. Since it seems unlikely that Capa would have gone through life without having told someone the circumstances surrounding the taking of his most famous photograph, we then contacted those people he might have talked with and asked them if Capa had ever mentioned the matter. Life did not reply. Henri Cartier-Bresson, Capa's professional associate in Magnum, the famous photographers group, said he was making a film in Spanish hospitals at the time and was not with Andre, Capa's real name, when he shot the picture. But he suggested that Capa's brother Cornell might know more. Stéphane Laurent in Picture Post said that no first-hand knowledge of how Robert Capa took the photograph, but he forwarded the inquiry to Cornell Capa. Then Cornell Capa replied to a letter in the author's, "Strangely enough, real answers are hard to come by. I had never seen or heard from Bob details about that particular photograph or that particular sequence. Neither did he write about it." But Cornell Capa later told us what he described as a tongue-in-cheek review by John Hersey, the author and former correspondent, now in a defunct magazine 47, of Robert Capa's book, Slightly Out of Focus. In this review, titled The Man Who Invented Himself, Hersey gives an account of how Robert Capa took the famous photograph. In reply to our query about his sources, Hersey wrote, Bob Capa told me the story of the photograph of the Spanish soldier himself. The Man Who Invented Himself was based altogether on material I had straight from him. He was a close friend. I had been through the Sicilian campaign with him. Robert Capa's account to Hersey was that he went to Andalusia in August 1936 when heavy fighting was taking place. During one battle, he was in a trench with company of Republican volunteers, fanatical but ignorant fighters, who shouted, Viva la Repubblica! Jumped over the parapet and charged a nationalist machine gun nest. When the machine gun opened fire, killing many of the men, the rest retreated and from the trench fired at the machine gun. They charged again, and each time many were killed, Hersey wrote. Finally, as they charged, the photographer timidly raised his camera to the top of the parapet, and without looking, at the instant of the first machine gun burst, pressed the button. He set the film to Paris undeveloped. 2 months later, he, Capa, was notified that Capa was now in truth a famous, talented, and nearly rich photographer, for the random snapshot had turned out to be a clear picture of a brave man in the act of falling dead as he ran, and it had been published over the name of Capa in newspapers all over the world. This is an intriguing account. Some, from Martha Gellhorn, who knew Capa in Spain and later believed that Capa was pulling Hersey's leg, and that this account is not to be taken seriously. Hersey's review gives no indication of this, and there is nothing in his letter to suggest that he took what his close friends to him told him as other than true and accurate. If it's so, then it shows that Capa's famous photograph was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance. A camera aimed blindly and operated on the sound of the firing had only caught a soldier neatly framed, but had caught him at the very moment he was hit. Further research produced 2 other strange versions of the moment of death photograph. It must be stressed immediately, at this distance in time, it has so far proved impossible either to confirm or disprove them, and other people who knew Capa in Spain, including Herbert Matthews and Martha Gellhorn, discount them entirely and firmly believe the photograph to both be Capa's and, without a doubt, authentic. The first account is from Canadian playwright Ted Allen. Allen, then only 20, was in Spain with the Canadian Blood Transfusion Unit. He also sent reports for Federated Press, a trade union news agency in North America. He met Capa in Madrid, became friends with Capa and Gerda Tero, Capa's partner and lifelong love, and was with Gerda when she was killed at Brunet in July 1937. Allen says that after the moment of death photograph was published, he discussed one day with Chim David Seymour, a photographer who was killed during the Suez invasion in 1956. Chim told me that Capa had not taken that photograph. Whether he told me that he, Chim, had taken it or that Gerda had taken it, I cannot now remember. The second account is by Odie Gallagher, a London Daily Express correspondent in Spain, first with the Nationalists and then with the Republicans. Gallagher says that at one stage of the war, he and Capa were sharing a room. There had been little action for several days, and Capa and others complained to Republican officers that he could not get any pictures. Finally, says Gallagher, a Republican officer told them he would detail some troops to go with Capa to some trenches nearby, and they would stage some maneuvers for them to photograph. Capa came back at the end of the day, delighted with what he had taken. When the moment of death photograph was published, Gallagher says he remarked to Kappa how genuine the picture looked because it was not quite in focus. He had a good laugh and said, "If you want to get good action shots, they mustn't be in focus. If your hand trembles a little, then you get a fine action shot." It is, of course, not unknown for photographers to pose pictures. In fact, Cornell Kappa sent us an Italian photography magazine, another Kappa photograph of the period, clearly posed, showing 9 Republican militiamen standing outside a trench, grinning and waving their rifles in the air. The Italian magazine writer confuses matter further by placing the moment of death photograph as having been taken near Cares. Then he adds that, despite similarities in appearance, he has resisted the temptation to conclude that the moment of death soldier looks to be the same one, still alive, at the left of the posed group photograph. But was the group photograph taken before or after the moment of death picture? If before, why were the soldiers standing in full view of nationalist machine gun nests? In the end, the emotive moment of death photograph, like so many other aspects of the Civil War, turns out not to be the clear and simple statement of fact that it at first sight appears. One other symbol in Spain was Ernest Hemingway, by far the most famous of the English-language writers there during the war, an influential figurehead in the fight against fascism. How could this fight be lost now, with Hemingway on our side? Hemingway had already worked one propaganda film, Spain in Flames, and had agreed to help with another, The Spanish Earth. When he accepted an offer from the North American Newspaper Alliance to report the war, he arrived in Spain for his first visit in March 1937, and although altogether made 4 trips. He traveled widely, usually with Martha Gellhorn, Herbert Matthews, and Sefton Delmer, saw a lot of the fighting, and got to know many of the Republican leaders and supporters. Yet his performance as a war correspondent was abysmally bad. On a technical level, his descriptions of battle and bombardments are monotonous. His emphasis on his own close location to the action smacks of boastfulness. His accounts of blood, wounds, and severed legs are typical of his desire to shock, and his reporting of conversations is so totally Hemingwayan style as to make the reader doubt their authenticity. NANA had asked him to confine his work to human interest features, and when that failed, to report only developments of vital importance. As his biographer, Carlos Baker, puts it, his eye for telling details and individual traits was not nearly so sharp as that of Dos Passos, or did he commonly rise to the meticulous exactitude and inclusiveness which characterized the best work of Matthews and Delmer. True, Hemingway grew up politically in Spain, believed it was the place to stop fascism before Hitler's brown shirts and Mussolini's black shirts could precipitate a Second World War, but he was unjustifiably optimistic about the Republicans' chances of doing this. One of his principal informants was Mikhail Koltsov, the Pravda and the Vestia correspondent who quarreled with Louis Fisher over an accurate but pessimistic dispatch Fisher had written. And this might explain the views Hemingway expressed to reporters in New York in June 1938. Franco was short of troops, and Hemingway said, handicapped by the friction among the elements in his army, the Republicans were well organized, and their chances of winning were good. Actually, at that moment, the Republicans were only 6 months away from defeat, but these criticisms are the least serious of Hemingway's shortcomings as a war correspondent. The most important concerns his total failure to report the communist persecution, imprisonment, and summary execution of, quote, untrustworthy elements, end quote, on the Republican side, when he knew that this was happening, and when disclosing it might have well prevented further horrors like this. The principal communist hatchet man was André Marty, who admitted to some 500 executions. Others would multiply that figure by 5 or even 10. Marty was gripped by a paranoid suspicion and devoted most of his time to passionate spy hunts. He was convinced that many of the volunteers who came to his headquarters were fascist spies, and he conducted day-long, soul-destroying interrogations, never shrinking from promptly liquidating doubtful cases, rather than put the Republic at risk from what he called, quote, petty bourgeois indecision, end quote. Gustav Regler, working as a political commissar with the international brigades, knew about Marty's spy mania and the executions, and he told all he knew to Hemingway. Hemingway never wrote a word of it in his dispatches. Regler believed that Hemingway, quote, respected, end quote, the information because all of the groups fighting for the Republic, the Communist Party, was the most active. There is further evidence that Hemingway knew of the executions. Juan dos Passos, working with Hemingway on the Spanish Earth, was determined to find out what had happened to Jose Robles Passos, formerly a teacher at Johns Hopkins University. Dos Passos' Spanish instructor, or translator, and a friend for 20 years. Robles had joined the Republican Army as a colonel, but had suddenly been arrested in December 1936. Hemingway undertook to help Dos Passos in his inquiries about Robles, and was soon able to report back that he had obtained the personal word of the head of the Republican counter-espionage that Robles would receive a fair trial. But the truth was that Robles had already been summarily executed. According to Carlos Baker, when Hemingway heard this, he simply assumed that Robles had been guilty. Then he not only failed to appreciate Dos Passos' shock and anger at the news, but also, later, he even wrote for Ken, the leftist magazine launched by the publisher of Esquire, an article condemning Dos Passos for the naivety of a typical American liberal attitude. Dos Passos never forgave him. Finally, just before his last visit to Spain, in October 1938, Hemingway admitted to his editor, Maxwell Perkins of Scribner, what he had not written as a correspondent, that there was, quote, a carnival of treachery and rottenness on both sides, end quote. In the end, Hemingway did write it all in For Whom the Bell Tolls, but from a war correspondent, the reader has the right to expect all the news the correspondent knows at the time, not just interpolations as a world of romantic fiction published when the war is over. The truth was that Hemingway, for all his compassion for the Spaniards, for all his commitment to the Republican cause, used the war to gain a new lease on his life as a writer. As Baker says, refusing to waste the best of his materials in his newspaper dispatches, he had gathered and salted away a body of experience and information which he described to Perkins as, quote, absolutely invaluable. For a novelist, this was understandable. For a war correspondent, it was unforgivable. Madrid surrendered on March 28, 1939. Only one full-time correspondent stayed on to see the nationalists' triumphant entry into the city, O.D. Gallagher of the Daily Express. Hidden in the basement of the Ritz Hotel with a supply of water and tinned food, he was awakened one morning by crowds shouting, "Franco! Franco!" Gallagher's messenger boy managed to get about 20 short reports to the telegraph office before nationalist press officers found Gallagher, told him he was lucky not to be shot, and ordered him out of Spain. This gesture of professional determination was one of the few bright moments in the closing months of the war. For, as the prospect of defeat came closer, correspondents with the Republicans found it increasingly difficult to overlook the fact that their side was not all they hoped it would be. Many of its shortcomings had been present from the early days. In the British International Brigade, the hand grenades were useless, the Russian rifles not much better. Training was farcical. Men were flung into the Battle of Jarama after firing 10 rounds at an improvised range. A Russian officer gave orders to advance that amounted to suicide. At the end of 2 days' fighting, only 100 men were left out of a battalion of over 600. Food was desperately short in Madrid, although supplies from Valencia arrived constantly, only to be inefficiently stored in locked warehouses until they rotted. Weak, unintelligent officers were built up into hero figures, only to collapse at the first major crisis. Brigades on some fronts had an average of only 250 serviceable rifles for 1,600 men, while trucks loaded with arms and ammunition remained marooned because of quarrels between local organizations who should be responsible for them. During the retreat in Catalonia, the Catalans failed to obey mobilization orders. Officers got into cars and drove away from the front, and anarchists began putting factories out of action. Factionalism, cruelty, political maneuvering, and intergroup armed conflict marked the dying days of the Republic. The failure of correspondents to report the imperfect face of the Republican side does not seem to have been due, except in the case of confessed propagandists, to any policy of duplicity, but to their preoccupation with the effect that the war was having on them personally. Certainly, no other war seems to have left such a profound and lasting impression on those who reported it. Matthews wrote in his last dispatch from Spain, "And the lessons I had learned, they seemed worth a great deal. Even then, heartsick and discouraged as I was, something sang inside me. I, like the Spaniards, had fought my way and lost, but I could not be persuaded that I had set too bad an example." André Malraux said he attached great importance to the war, not only as a struggle, but also because it was a most profound experience of brotherhood. Martha Gellhorn has said that to this day she cannot read a book about the Spanish Civil War because they might get the facts straight, but none capture the emotion, the commitment, and the feeling that we were all in it together, the certainty that we were right. By Drew Middleton's definition, the personal involvement made the war correspondents unable to fulfill their duty because they had lost their objectivity. Matthew's provision for open, honest bias, so long as the reader was still given all the facts, did not work out any better. Much of Matthews's Spanish Civil War reporting was brilliant. His battle descriptions, his evocation of the emotion of the period, his honest striving to balance Carney's propaganda and the nationalist faking justified the praise his American supporters accorded him. He was right in his battles with the New York Times over its attitude to the war, and his verdict is justified. It failed its readers because it did not give them, quote, a competent, balanced, complete journalistic picture of the war, end quote. But equally, Matthew's open, honest bias, his reporting with his heart as well as his mind, affected his judgment. At the time, he saw the war as, quote, a struggle against the forces of evil, end quote. Now he agrees that he was wrong to regard the conflict in straightforward ideological terms, and that he oversimplified a very complex situation, and that it was more than anything a civil war, a Spanish war, a conflict whose primary causes and manifestations were to be found in Spanish history. At the time, he felt that anyone who had lived through that period with the Republicans had experienced something so wonderful that it could not occur again. Spain was a melting pot in which the dross came out and the pure gold remained. Now, he says, my judgment is not as clouded as it was, and I know a great deal about the war that I could not have known at the time, especially features derogatory to the Loyalists and to the Internationals. The drawback of reporting with heart as well as mind is that if the cause is basically just, as the Republican one undoubtedly was, the correspondent tends to write in terms of heroic endeavor rather than face unpalatable facts, and to mislead his readers with unjustified optimism. Few resisted the temptation. Sefton Delmer was none too enthusiastic about the way the Republicans ran the war, and his dispatches reflected this. Stephen Spender saw that the soldiers hated the heroics of the leftist correspondents, and that even the rather restrained reporting of Philip Jordan in the News Chronicle was too much for them. I had the impression that soldiers in a war have an almost pathetic longing to know the truth. Spender also recorded that whereas the war had at first unified the social revolution, in the long run it demanded its own measures, which threatened to engulf the whole social system. George Orwell stands out. He saw the failure of the liberals and the left, the refusal to recognize that totalitarianism existed on the Republican side as well as the right, that Stalin's real enemy in Spain was the independent left, and the communists were more concerned with eliminating it than defeating the fascists. He tried to report this, but the New Statesman refused to use his dispatches. He wrote it in homage to Catalonia, only to have the book turned down by left-wing publisher Victor Gollancz. When the book was eventually published in Britain by Secker and Warburg, it sold only 600 copies in Orwell's lifetime, but it was not published in the United States until after his death. The cause was lost, and no one could bear to hear why. The Spanish Civil War was a crusade, but in many ways it was also a cheat and a delusion. Orwell was able to accept this and still be glad that he had taken part. Curiously enough, the whole experience has left me with not less but more belief in the decency of human beings. For most other correspondents, the myth they had helped create remained preferable to the painful reality. And that's the end of that chapter. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. If you have friends that are interested in hearing about this aspect of history, please share it with them. And please comment with feedback on what you've heard. One of the cool things about where we are in this book, which is not about half finished, is that we're moving into more well-known times in history. So I look forward to hearing some other points of view. Thanks.